welcome to Wilder Outdoor Academy. In today's lesson, I'm going to teach you how to make a garden plan. Now, why do you want to make a garden plan? For me right now, it's the middle of winter. We just got a snowstorm. In fact, we are in the middle of one as I record this. But the reason we want to plan our garden is because that's the way we make sure that it is successful when we get to the spring. I know a lot of people, myself included, in my first few years of gardening, what I did was I just put a ton of seeds in the ground. Bought stuff at Home Depot, whatever there was, I'd plant it and just hope for the best. And some stuff worked and it was exciting until year 2. And then nothing worked, right? Because I wasn't planning. I wasn't doing it smart. I wasn't doing it in a smart way. So today I'm going to show you how to plan a spring garden. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, we don't have space for a garden. I don't have time for all that work. I will tell you that anyone who has access to at least 5 square feet of space that gets 8 hours or more of sunlight, you can have a garden. Anyone can have a garden. It's great. And if you can't have a garden, you can grow your own food. The other reason that I love planting my garden during the winter is because it reminds me that spring is coming and winter is ending soon, which today I need that. So let's get started. The first step when you plan your garden is going to be choosing your space. Now, like I said in the introduction, you don't need a lot of space. You just need a spot, any spot, that gets 8 or more hours of direct sunlight during the summer. So remember that during the summer, the days get longer. I don't know how to calculate that if you're measuring it during the winter, but if you got a sunny spot in your yard, you probably know where it is. Now, what you're going to want to do is measure out that space. Now, it might be a huge space. My garden's big-ish, but it's about, mine is about 20 feet by about 10 feet. That's the spot or the space I have. You might have just 5 feet. It might be on a balcony, and that's okay because there are lots of ways to plant plants that will provide you with food. So the first step, find that spot. Find a space that receives at least 8 hours of sunlight during the summer, and take measurements. Take measurements of that space because that's going to play in here real soon. It's real important. So once you have your space identified, the next question that you need to ask is, what should I be planting and how much soil? And there's always so many questions. The first question you should ask yourself after you know you have a space is, why am I planting a garden? And truth in every area of life is always lead with your why. Because why you are growing food will affect what you grow and how you grow it and when you grow it, and even what kind of fertilizer you might want to use. So start with your why. And here's an example. For me, I love to cultivate as much food as possible. So I want to get a ton of food. I want to preserve it. I want to feed my family. I want to have them engaged in a process that they are familiar with when they eat their food, that they know where their green bean came from. And so what I choose is plants that produce a ton of food. And I learn how to preserve them. So for me, that's green beans, that's zucchini. You can't really preserve lettuce and kale, but they are very productive, and you can do what's called succession planting if you get a little more advanced with this stuff. But that's what I choose because I want a lot of food. Now, maybe it's not a lot of food. Maybe you just want one meal. Maybe you want pizza. Maybe you want bruschetta. My wife loves bruschetta. She's a lot fancier than I am. What she would grow in her garden, then, if all she wanted was bruschetta, would be tomatoes and basil. Now, my wife wants a lot more than that, so we have obviously a big garden, and so do I. But if that's what you're going for, that's what you need, and you don't need a ton of space for that. So you get the idea. Plan out what you want to grow. Maybe you have a favorite vegetable. Maybe your kids have a favorite vegetable. Plan with your why in mind. Now, once you have your why in place, like once you know why you're doing this, there will be a few next steps that you should take. The first thing is you should research what kinds of plants will meet your goals. Most states have what is called an extension campus. So within public universities, there's usually a unit that has to, by mandate, provide information to the public education, especially around things like agriculture. And so they tend to have really, really great information uh, about every kind of plant you can grow in your region, from varieties to season, to when to plant, to how to harvest, how to troubleshoot diseases. They're great resources. In fact, I'll show you mine here in a bit. We live in Minnesota. Now, that being said, they can be a little bit dense. They can have a lot of information on those pages, and again, you can get overwhelmed. So what I like to focus on, or what you will focus on for just your garden plan specifically, is going to be the amount of space you need for each, in between each seed when you plant, or each seedling. The second thing is going to be the time to harvest. Uh, Different plants take different amounts of time to get to a place where they are producing things that you can eat. And both of those things will factor into our garden planning. With that, I will show you the website here that we have in our state, and hopefully you have in your state as well.
This is the University of Minnesota Extension website. And as you can see, it's got a lot of great information here. I have it specifically set right now, or I've opened up the page for growing tomatoes, but your state should have an extension campus as part of their public university, and they will have lots of great information on gardening and all sorts of other things. If for some reason your state does not have an extension campus, just look for one in a neighboring state. Chances are your climates are pretty similar. So when I go to my extensions website, there are two things I want to look for. The first thing that I mentioned was the time to harvest. Now, this website does not list a specific time to harvest for tomatoes, but it does tell me when to start seeds. And that's really what I'm going to use the time to harvest to plan for. So here it says to plant seeds indoors 5 to 6 weeks before planting outside, or to start seeds, not necessarily plant them. The other thing I want to look up is space. How much space do I need between my plants? And so on this page, I will go to transplanting. And here we can see that we need 2 to 3 feet in all directions for vining varieties of tomatoes. We can put bush types a little closer together, but again, about 2 feet is going to be a great estimate for the amount of space each tomato plant will need.
Now, once you've decided what you will plant and you know how much space each of those needs, what you're going to do is draw out a little map of your garden. It doesn't need to be fancy, doesn't need to be sophisticated, but what it does need to do is reflect the actual dimensions of your space. What I'm going to do is use the spacing for the seeds and the seedlings that I got from the website, from the extension website, and I'm going to draw out where I'm going to put these plants and where they're going to grow. And so if a plant can take 4 feet and I have a diagram that says I have 8 feet in my garden, I'll put the plant in the middle of that on my little diagram and mark out 4 feet and know that I can put 2 of those plants in that row potentially. I'll show you here how I've done mine in a second. But again, we're just going to draw a little map of our garden. That's it.
Here is an example of how I map out my garden. So this is my actual garden from a few years ago. What you can see here is that I've put each bed within the garden, and I have a fence around the garden too, so I've drawn that here. Um, but I've written out the dimensions for each bed. So most of my raised beds are 5 feet by 3 feet, and I've written sort of shorthand, or just a few letters to tell me what each plant I was going to grow was. So GB stands for green beans, HBS stands for herbs, P for peppers, KL for kale. You get the idea. Thinking about the tomatoes that we looked up on the extensions website, I have those over in this bed. And what you can see is in my 5 by 3 bed, I followed the advice of the extension website, and I've kept 3 feet in between 2 tomato plants. And if I planted my tomato plants 3 feet apart, I could fit two in that bed and have 1 foot on either side for them to grow and still have walking room in between the beds. And I did this for each of the plants, again, following the instructions on um, the extension's website.
Now that we've mapped out our garden, there are a few things to take into consideration. The most important is going to be when to plant. So typically, if anything needs to be direct sown, you'll see that on a website or any seed packets you have. That just means putting the seeds directly in the ground. When you do that, that needs to be after what is typically the last frost date of your area. So go online, look up last frost in blank. For me, it's last frost in Bloomington, Minnesota. I look that up, and I know that typically it's around the end of May, beginning of June. A good rule of thumb in my community is June 1st. So I know on June 1st, anything that gets direct seeded is being put directly in. But, because it's the winter still, anything that needs more than that and is not direct seeded, or needs more time than that to grow before it starts producing fruit, or is needs to be transplanted, I have to seed now in the winter. And so a good rule of thumb for me, and that I use, I shouldn't say, it's a good rule of thumb for anyone. Take the days to fruiting that you get for your plants and subtract 30 days. Because typically it'll take about a month for a plant to go into the ground and start producing fruit if it's through the course of its fruiting cycle. So take the time to fruit that you looked up for each plant, subtract 30 days, and that's typically when you should be starting your seeds indoors. And it's important for planting purposes, because if you want bruschetta and you live in Minnesota, you got to start your tomatoes early. We don't have a very long planting season. And in fact, if I direct seed my tomatoes, they will not grow tomatoes because the planting or the gardening season is not long enough for those plants to produce any tomatoes. So subtract 30 days and then plant or start your seeds based on that. Now, if that if your website or your seed packets have information about when exactly to start them, just listen to that. That makes more sense. But if not, that's a great rule you can use. It's going to help you out. So a few tips for you as you think about how to plan your garden. The first is that if you live in the northern hemisphere, during the summer, the sun is going to be in the southern part of the sky. What that means is that shadows will be cast going north. So if you plant all your tall plants on the southern side of your garden, you're going to actually crowd out anything that's above that with shade. And so the plants that are north of your tall plants won't grow very tall because they'll be fighting for nutrients, for sunlight. So I like to plant my tallest plants on the north side of my garden. Another thing to think about is you will want rows. Somehow you'll want to be able to walk through your garden. And this is primarily about picking your food. So what you want to be sure of is that you don't have to walk on some of your plants to get to your other plants, right? So try to plan a walking space through your garden. Also, you don't want beds that are super wide because you might have to reach over and to get one, you break another plant. That's no fun. That's no fun for anyone. So try to plan as many walkways or pathways through your garden as you can, especially if it's bigger. The other thing was I said that you don't need a lot of space for this. You don't even need soil for this. Let's say you live in an apartment complex. That's cool. If you've got a balcony that gets 8 hours of sunlight, you can plant food-giving plants, food-bearing plants in all kinds of containers. It could be a 5-gallon bucket. Go to Home Depot. Just poke some holes in the bottom so it drains. There are people who grow things in tires. There are people who grow things in potato bags, in garbage bags even. Look up creative ways to grow potatoes. You'll see some really wild stuff. Don't think that having dirt that you can dig is a limitation. You only need 8 hours of sunlight. That's it. So with that, I wish you happy garden planting.